Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to explore how a mid-18th century religious movement didn't just change what was happening inside local churches. It actually fundamentally rewired society. It laid the very groundwork for the modern democracy that you and I live in today. We're looking at the First Great Awakening over in America and the simultaneous sparks of the Wesleyan Revival in England.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Sparking the Great Awakening. 2. The Establishment Strikes Back. 3. Theology Transforms Higher Education. 4. Seeds of the Revolution. 5. Arminius Challenges the Status Quo. And 6. John Wesley's Dramatic Origins. We've got a lot of ground to cover spanning 2 continents and multiple decades, so let's just dive right in.
Section 1. Sparking the Great Awakening, the personalities behind the revival. Now, this movement really began in earnest around 1734. At the time, deism, which is basically this belief in a very distant, uninvolved creator, was really starting to take hold in society, and the Great Awakening just exploded as a direct, passionate, evangelical answer to all that detachment. At the very heart of this revival were 2 guys with completely opposite personalities. I mean, they were starkly different. On one hand, you have George Whitefield. He was the grand itinerant, loud, intensely charismatic, famous for preaching outdoors in village squares and city streets, completely ignoring denominational lines. Then on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Jonathan Edwards, a super quiet, studious guy who literally spent about 16 hours a day studying. When Edwards preached his deeply Calvinistic sermons, he famously wouldn't even look at the congregation. He just kept his eyes glued to the bell rope at the back of the church. But here's the crazy part. Despite being total opposites, both men drew these massive, convicted crowds. Well, as you can probably guess, not everyone was thrilled with these huge emotional crowds. Which brings us to Section 2, the establishment strikes back, institutional pushback.
The establishment essentially struck back against the emotion of these revivals in 3 main ways. First, it completely fractured some denominations. Take the Presbyterians, for example. They split right down the middle into the old side, who thought the revivals were way too emotional and unbiblical, and the new side, who were totally on board with the awakenings. Second, the movement faced intense pushback from highly influential individual opponents. And third, they faced massive opposition from the major universities.
A prime example of one of those influential opponents was Charles Chauncey. He was the prestigious pastor of the First Congregational Church over in Boston. Chauncey looked at the Great Awakening and saw a profound threat to enlightened reason. To him, all this intense emotionalism was just dangerous, unhinged chaos. He didn't want emotion, he wanted strict sobriety, reason, and rationality to dictate religious life. And this deep divide leads to a genuinely fascinating piece of history regarding that university opposition we mentioned. Both Harvard and Yale were originally founded by Puritans for this specific purpose of training ministers and teaching the Bible. In fact, Harvard's original 1636 motto was Veratus in Christo et Ecclesia, truth in Christ and the Church. But by the time the Great Awakening rolled around, they'd completely dropped that second half, leaving just Veratus. Both Harvard and Yale officially came out against the revivals, citing that exact same fear of emotionalism. But get this, ironically, 50 years later, Yale itself would actually become the birthplace of the Second Great Awakening. So because the established universities basically shut their doors to the revival, the movement had no choice but to build its own. Section 3. Theology Transforms Higher Education, an Educational Legacy. The First Great Awakening sparked this massive drive for higher education to prepare a brand new generation of pro-revival ministers. This era directly led to the rapid-fire founding of some incredibly iconic institutions. You've got Princeton, founded to train Presbyterian ministers, then Brown in 1764 by the Baptists, Rutgers by the Dutch Reformed Church, and Dartmouth in 1769 for congregational preachers. This theological fervor literally required entirely new academic foundations, completely reshaping the American educational landscape. But the ripple effects went way beyond just education. We're talking massive sociological shifts. Section 4. Seeds of the Revolution. Accidental democratic ideals. This is where the movement directly impacts the political world we know today. The Awakening championed a personal religious experience that was available to absolutely anyone, and that instantly elevated the common person. It stressed lay leadership, meaning everyday folks suddenly realized, hey, we don't need some elite, ordained class to lead us. We can step up ourselves. People started gathering in strictly voluntary public assemblies in parks and town squares.
They were choosing to listen to leaders based on their godly authority rather than some title handed down by a king. It also sparked a huge humanitarian impulse, like George Whitefield raising funds for a massive orphanage down in Georgia. And crucially, it heavily promoted the separation of church and state. But note this, it wasn't to protect the state from religion. It was to protect the independence of the church from government meddling.
All of these shifts created a profound structural transformation in the mindset of the average citizen. It gave them the confidence to actively question authority. This quote really hits the nail on the head. Considered as a social event, the Great Awakening signifies nothing less than the first stage of the American Revolution.
So it really begs the question, would the American Revolution have even happened without the First Great Awakening? Think about it. The sheer weight of numbers in these massive voluntary assemblies showed everyday people their own collective sovereignty. The personal independence they just found in their religious lives translated directly into a desire for personal independence in their political lives. They learned how to assemble, how to choose their own leaders, and to feel totally free to criticize public office, up to and including the King of England.
Now, while this democratization of faith was sweeping across America like wildfire, the theological status quo was taking a major hit over in Europe. Section 5, Arminius challenges the status quo, the European parallel. Enter Jacob Arminius, a prominent Dutch theologian. The irony here is rich. Arminius was actually hired by Dutch Calvinists to provide a robust defense of Calvinism, but as he dove into the actual work, he found that he couldn't do it. He fundamentally disagreed with John Calvin on several specific, highly critical points of theology.
So Arminius and his followers drafted a detailed argument called the Remonstrance. Let's break down exactly what he argued. First, he totally rejected Calvin's doctrine of double election, which is the idea that God predestines specific people to heaven and others to hell. Instead, he favored the idea that God simply foreknows who will choose to be saved. Second, he argued that Christ died for absolutely everyone, the whosoever, not just a select elect group. Now, he did agree with Calvin that humans have no good in themselves to save themselves. It is 100% by God's grace. However, and this is the kicker, he argued that this grace can be resisted by human free will, and because of that, it's actually possible for someone to lose their salvation once they had gained it. This Arminian framework became incredibly influential in British religious life.
And that specific theological framework is exactly what would shape our next central figure. Section 6. John Wesley's dramatic origins.
John Wesley was born in 1703 to Samuel, an Anglican priest, and his truly remarkable mother, Susanna Wesley. Listen to this. Susanna bore an astonishing 19 children, which is mind-blowing enough until you realize she herself was actually one of 25 children. But she was so much more than just a matriarch. Susanna was the rigorous academic and theological tutor for her family. She meticulously taught John the Bible, theology, mathematics, and history. She profoundly shaped his entire intellectual and spiritual foundation.
But John's story almost ended before it even really began. When he was just a little boy, his family's home, the Epworth Rectory, caught on fire. He was trapped inside the burning building, but his father and some neighbors managed to run in and miraculously pull him out just in the nick of time. For the rest of his adult life, John Wesley referred to himself as a brand plucked from the fire. That intense near-death experience instilled in him this incredibly deep, lifelong conviction that he was spared for a specific divine purpose.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to close on. Think about this young boy. He survives the terrifying flames of the Epworth Rectory, gets tutored by an absolute theological powerhouse of a mother, and steps into a world that is steeped in these fierce new debates over Arminian theology. Soon, he'll head off to Oxford University. So how exactly will this surviving child use that foundation to ignite the massive Wesleyan revival in England, mirroring those revolutionary awakenings happening in America? Well, that is a story for another time. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep on learning.